Yeah, as Andy said, I am 100% in no way an expert on climate change, but the book was super interesting and kind of seemed fitting with the G7 summit this week. Yeah, so it kind of, the book does what it says on the tin. It's just kind of laying out a strategy, as Bill Gates sees it, of how to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But what I quite liked about it was you hear so many depressing things about climate change all the time, all the statistics. And I think it can feel a bit hopeless, like there isn't really a solution to it and that actually we can do nothing. And this just felt quite positive. And it felt like it was quite solvable, that it'd be really tricky and that it's really kind of pressing, but that actually that we can do something about it. So that was quite nice. So if we just jump into the first thing. Sorry, yeah, so it's very does what it says on the tin. It's just a strategy. Yeah, so the first thing that I took out of it was that reducing emissions actually isn't enough, and we need to get to net zero. So obviously a lot of the targets that we hear about like halving or taking the emissions back by a big percentage, but actually argues that if we do that, we'll still get to the tipping point. And he uses a really nice bathtub analogy where if a bath's filling with water, that it's still going to overflow at some point if you just turn the tap down. So actually what you need to do is turn the tap off entirely and let some of the water out that's already there. And we do have a few kind of like techniques that you can use to take some of the carbon out of the atmosphere, but that ultimately we need to be turning the tap off so that it kind of stops adding more carbon to the atmosphere, and hopefully we will not reach the tipping point. And that we actually need to do that by 2050, and that it's quite pressing. And I kind of thought, well, if we've got to take it back, then hopefully our cutting back on our emissions are gonna, it's like a good stepping stone to getting there. But actually what he argues is that you'd be doing very different things if you were cutting down your emissions as to getting to net zero altogether. And he uses the example of gas power stations. So that's something that they're talking about kind of implementing because it emits less carbon. But actually, I think he was saying to make gas power stations cost effective, they've got to be used for years and years and years. So actually, in the long run, it will still be emitting an awful lot of carbon versus if you were using renewables sooner and might need to top it up with fossil fuels for the moment. So actually we need to set the goal correctly in the first place rather than having lots of stepping stones that might take away from the ultimate goal. And that kind of takes us on to the second point, that actually it's unrealistic to think that we're going to be able to massively reduce the power that the world uses at the moment. So going for clean power over no power, it's completely unrealistic to stop the demand for fuel. It would change our entire way of life that we live in at the moment. And it's also unrealistic for developing countries to not start using more fuel as well. Obviously, as it becomes more available readily, then people are going to want to use it, and that's kind of fair, and it'd be immoral to stop countries from needing more as well. So what he argues is that we need to replace fossil fuels with renewables and electrify everything, and use this clean fuel to power the electricity by having a bit of a portfolio of renewable fuels available. Obviously, that's a massive overhaul of the system that we use at the moment, and we're taking in a huge amount of like investment and research and development and general public engagement, everything. Like, it's a massive undertaking. But he argues that's the only way that we can possibly do it. There's already a bit of a move towards it across the world, I think, with lots of cities making like their vehicle fleet electric and a big push towards air source heat pumps. But that's kind of the way that we need to be going. He does make a bit of a side point. Obviously, Bill Gates' background is in, apart from Microsoft, is in global health. And that's where his kind of social side is focused. And he argues that actually developing countries need to be still focusing on global health, and that this is very much a developed country, I guess, problem in the first place, and that they have a little bit more time to catch up. And that's where they should be spending their funds at the moment on global health problems. So that also leads into the next problem or point. And this was a big one for me. He argues that we need a massive PR campaign for nuclear power. I had a lot of reservations about nuclear, I think, similar to a lot of people. But one of the big problems with renewable energy obviously is intermittency. If you're using wind, then you need wind. If you're using solar, you need the sun. And at the periods of time that you don't have those resources available to you, then obviously you can't be producing energy, and it's also incredibly difficult to store the amounts of energy that we need to use later on. And the only current renewable that we have available that doesn't have issues with intermittency is nuclear. And obviously, because of such a time pressure, we need to work with what we've got available. And he argues that that's going to be one of the key contenders in helping to solve the problem. And he talks a lot about cars, and how when cars became available, we didn't stop using them because they were dangerous, but we made them safer. And that actually we have a lot of the technology available to us to make nuclear safer, but because of the horrible big disasters that we've had, that people are understandably really reluctant and hesitant to use nuclear. But actually his argument is that's where the potential is currently, as well as investing in new technologies and developing other areas. He says that, I thought it was quite an interesting fact, that air pollution kills more people each year than nuclear has ever done, with the disasters that we've had. So yeah, a huge campaign for nuclear, he argues, is needed. And leading on to my next thing, although we can replace the fuel that we have with clean fuel, we still need to overhaul every way that we live life at the moment, and there's going to make there's a lot of changes that are needed. And there's 5 key areas that we would need to do that, he argues. Renewables, as we chatted about. Sorry, this book is very, very overview, so there's a lot that he goes through very quickly. There isn't time in this talk, or really in the book, to go massively into details. He just alludes to different areas in these 5 things that would need to change. Renewables, manufacturing, the way that we produce our goods, how we grow food and what we eat. So that comes down to fertilizer and using different types of fertilizer, less fertilizers, and eating less meat and dairy, travel. And a big one for me I didn't know about was how we heat and cool our homes. It was a thing, but maybe not quite such a contender as it is, and we need different ways of doing that. Again, it was about 2 months ago that I read this book, and there were lots of details on heating and cooling, but they have gone from my mind entirely. But yeah, that was important. And also that at the moment carbon is extremely cheap, and we can use a lot of carbon very, very cheaply. He argues that it ends up per litre being cheaper than Coca-Cola in a lot of countries. But actually there needs to be a carbon tax so that we're paying the real cost for carbon that we use. And that at the moment there's a big green premium, and it makes green solutions not very attractive or doable for most countries. And that the green premium is the difference in price between the polluting fuel and the green solutions. So if we do have this carbon tax, that'll help reduce that, as well as research and development and investment in these areas. And if we're kind of creating more green solutions, then people are going to invest in them, and that kind of gradually helps bring them closer together. And the last point is just that we need to talk about it, like everyone, all the time. It's not enough to be using our reusable coffee cups and taking our tote bags to Tesco. That actually, as individuals, we do have quite a lot of power, but that it goes kind of above and beyond our individual lifestyle choices, that we need to be putting pressure on the people that can make the change. So emailing supermarkets and MPs that what we really need is research and development and policy changes, and that actually they're not going to happen unless individually we all start kind of putting pressure on. And back to that, the power of the pound. And it's not just the kind of like the small tiny difference that our purchases make, but actually showing that there's a need and a demand in different green solutions, and when it's seen that there's demand, then that's where the investment comes from, and that will kind of be the springboard. And that actually our personal consumption is such a tiny element of it, but that if you are making changes, that you can choose those changes widely, and that some things like metal straws are probably going to be a very tiny thing compared to other areas in your life that you can change, such as a more drastic one like becoming vegan, or lots of different changes. And as a sideline, I read a really interesting book recently called How Bad a Banana Is, that kind of helps you make informed decisions on which areas you could change. And turns out bananas are actually really good, and they're not that bad at all. But I would recommend that if anybody is interested. So that was a really quick whistle-stop tour. I can't say you've read the book after listening to me for 5 minutes whistling on, but I would highly recommend reading it as well if you get a chance. It was really kind of quite reassuring in a way, as well as scary. So yeah, reducing emissions isn't enough. We need to be reducing it to zero, creating clean power over no power, that we need to have a look at nuclear to address intermittency, changing everything and overhaul, and pressing the policymakers to make these changes, and we need to talk about it.